We're working our way through the book of Ruth, and we've seen that Ruth is God's answer, or at least the beginning of God's answer to the problem of Judges. Judges ends with the nation of Israel in just a terrible spot, not so much financially, but spiritually. They have rebelled against God, and they have become as bad as the nations that were in the promised land before them. And so we're really wondering, is there any hope? And God uses this story of an individual family to illustrate that there is hope, to show us where the hope is, and to point us forward to how God is going to solve the problem that we see in Israel and really in this universe. And we've looked at the first couple of chapters. Begins with Naomi and Ruth, Naomi and her family in a foreign land, Naomi having to come back to Israel after pretty much all her family died, and then Ruth attaching herself to Naomi. She's this Moabitess, this foreigner, but she's got so much faith, and she's really a model of what it means to be a believer. And God honors that in chapter 2 as Ruth goes out to work and she meets Boaz, who is her kinsman redeemer, or actually Naomi's kinsman redeemer. And so we're wondering, is God going to use Boaz to rescue Naomi and her family? And it looks good because Boaz is a godly man, but yet we still have some questions at the end of chapter 2, because after this initial act of kindness, nothing much seems to happen. And one of the reasons that nothing much has seemed to happen in chapter 3 is because there is a redeemer who has rights before Boaz. One of the problems that Ruth faces is that she's a foreign widow, and so she has really no one that can act as a go-between between her and Boaz. How can Naomi come up with a way to find out if Boaz is even willing to help them by being their redeemer, while at the same time not putting Ruth in a position where she would be humiliated? The first 5 verses of chapter 3 are basically all Naomi talking. She explains her concern for Ruth in verse 1. Should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? And what's beautiful here is Naomi's concern for Ruth. We were disappointed by Naomi's attitude in the past, but here she's expressing unselfish love. She then tells Ruth her plan, and it's one that seems a little crazy, to be honest. She tells Ruth to wash up, put on perfume, get on a cloak, and go down to where Boaz works and wait until he goes to sleep after having finished eating and drinking, and then lie down at his feet after uncovering them. And this scheme of Naomi's is really a gamble, because how is Boaz supposed to interpret what Ruth is doing? There's really no question that he could have interpreted this as if Ruth were attempting to seduce him. But perhaps Naomi is counting on what she knows of Boaz's character. Listen to how Daniel Block explains the situation. He writes, "The delicacy of the scheme is obvious, and the potential for disaster is extreme. From a human perspective, Naomi seems to be taking a huge gamble that Boaz may not interpret this series of nonverbal gestures in accordance with the meaning she intends. Obviously, when Boaz awakes and discovers his feet uncovered and a woman lying nearby, the nonverbal communication is sufficiently ambiguous to be interpreted in any one of several ways. First, in that cultural and spiritual context, Boaz could wake up in the middle of the night and willingly accept Ruth's overtures, in his grogginess interpreting her actions to be that of a common prostitute. After all, the events described occurred in the dark days of Judges. Second, Boaz could wake up and interpret Ruth's actions as those of a prostitute, but as a noble and genuinely virtuous Israelite, shoo her off as an immoral woman with whom he would have nothing to do. Third, Boaz could wake up and recognize immediately the true meaning of Ruth's actions and respond favorably to her. Naomi's scheme is obviously a gamble. The effectiveness of her plan is measured by the extent to which Boaz's interpretation when he awakes conforms to the meaning she had intended in Ruth's actions. Either of the first 2 responses would have defeated Naomi's purpose. And far from securing Ruth's welfare, this poor Moabite woman would have returned home broken in body and bruised in spirit. From a natural perspective, the desired response was the least likely to occur. What are the chances that Boaz will wake up and in his groggy state notice that Ruth has covered herself with a simlah rather than the seductive garb of a prostitute? That's just a word to describe an outfit, a Hebrew word. And what will be the chances that he will, in his groggy state, recognize that when she introduces herself, she's not introducing herself as a prostitute, and that he will respond favorably toward her, overlooking the irregularities of the situation? A woman proposing to a man, a younger person proposing to an older person, a field worker proposing to a field owner, an alien proposing to a native, and that in fulfillment of Naomi's words, he will give Ruth reasonable instructions about how to proceed. But by this time, Naomi's faith is strong. She has confidence in Boaz's integrity and apparently in the hidden hand of God to govern his reaction when he awakes. And if there's anything that Ruth really encourages us in, so far at least, it's the providence of God. God is at work accomplishing his plan behind the scenes, often behind the scenes. Boaz shows up at the field at the right time. Boaz responds the way Naomi wants him to respond to Ruth. Ruth does what Naomi suggests, and after about 3 hours of lying at Boaz's feet, her heart beating, I'm sure, waiting, he wakes up. And the way the writer expresses himself in verse 8 helps us feel a little bit of the surprise of the situation. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. Ruth quickly makes her intentions clear. I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. That's a little bit different than Naomi's plan. Naomi had said, he will tell you what to do. But Ruth perhaps doesn't want there to be any misunderstanding. She wants Boaz to marry her. In Hebrew, spread one's wings over someone was a phrase describing marriage. This is a tense moment. How will Boaz respond? She's basically just asked, commanded him to marry her. He responds with grace and love. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And this is a remarkable transformation that we're reading about here. We should note it. When Ruth had arrived, she was nothing. And yet through her sacrificial devotion to her mother-in-law, she gained a reputation in the town in just a few months of being a worthy woman. There's a complication, however. Boaz is not the closest redeemer. He makes a plan to see if he'll be able to redeem her. He doesn't have to do this. This is grace. Boaz is proving that he truly is a man of character. Since it's night, he has her rest there, using a deliberately non-sexual word, actually, for lie down. He will not take advantage of Ruth. Then he sends her on her way, before her reputation would be tarnished in any way, even sending her with more food as a sign of his concern and generosity. In spite of all the impossibilities, we're seeing God is acting to rescue Ruth and Naomi, and he's going to do that through the work of a redeemer. That becomes very clear in chapter 4. First, Boaz has to deal with the legal problem in verses 1 to 12. Boaz goes up to the gate. This is where citizens and leaders of the town often gathered, and civil and administrative issues were resolved. He sits down. He's not going to rest until this issue is taken care of. The writer says, behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. This illustrates, again, God's providential care. It looks like a chance occurrence, but it's not. God is in complete control of every detail. The way Boaz relates to this Redeemer is very interesting, though. First, he calls him over, but the way the narrator describes him calling him over is a little bit funny. Our translation says, turn aside, friend. But the word friend isn't the best way of translating this, actually. It would be better translated so-and-so. We're going to see this man doesn't nearly have the character of Boaz, and he's not really a major point of the story. And so the narrator doesn't want you to be very impressed. Come over, so-and-so. Boaz begins by telling the Redeemer about Naomi and her land, and according to the ESV, instructing him to buy it from her. Probably, however, she wasn't in the actual position to sell it. The land of a deceased man, according to Numbers 27, would go to a son or a daughter, brother or an uncle, or another near relative. But there's no talk about it going to a widow. This is part of what made the widow's position so vulnerable and why people were supposed to look out for widows. More likely, it's that he was offering to give the land of Naomi's husband to this redeemer. During the 10 years Elimelech was in Moab, his land had most likely been taken by someone outside of his family. When Naomi returned, she wouldn't have been able to reclaim the land, and that's why Ruth had to go to someone else's field to start scavenging for food. Boaz here is attempting to get the land back into the hands of the family, and the only way to do that was by turning the land over into the hands of the Redeemer. This must have seemed like a good deal to the Redeemer at first, and so the Redeemer says, "I'll redeem it." Then Boaz introduces a complication. The day the Redeemer gets the land, he gets Ruth as well. And you can look at the way he introduces Ruth. Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead. He's got a plan, Boaz, for sure. And so he's thinking primarily about his own security, this Redeemer whom Boaz is talking to. And he says that he'll give up his right of redemption, and he goes through this custom with Boaz in which he hands over his right shoe to him. And Boaz responds by stating his purposes in redeeming Elimelech's estate. He says, "Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place." And the witnesses respond with a blessing that becomes a prophecy. They pray that God will enable Ruth to have children the way he did Rachel and Leah, and that their house will become like the house of Perez. And in verses 13 to 17, we finally come to the most important part of the book, really. God enables Ruth to have a child, and this child becomes the ancestor of David, who would become the king of Israel. Boaz took Ruth, he writes. She became his wife. He went into her, and God gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the village responds by blessing God. Even though Naomi's life had been difficult up to this point, God had a great purpose in the middle of those trials, and that was to bring her to this point where she could become part of his great plan for rescuing Israel by providing a godly king to rule over them. You never know what God's going to do. You know he's going to be faithful, but he can surprise us in just how he can take these impossible, terrible circumstances and use them to accomplish something beautiful. And this child will be Naomi's redeemer. In spite of all that Naomi had lost, God had given her something even more precious, a daughter-in-law who loves her and who is of more worth to her than 7 sons. And this is a huge compliment, and in a sense it tells us that a big part of the purpose of this book is to highlight the godliness of Ruth. As one author explains, even though the book of Ruth is about Naomi, it's her story, the women praise Ruth. Her love, her faithfulness brought redemption. A more accurate title for the book might be The Story of Naomi, how the extraordinary, unstoppable love of a Moabite woman not only redeemed a family, but rescued a nation and taught that nation to love. More than anyone else in the history of Israel, Ruth embodies the fundamental principle of the nation's ethic. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. Ironically, it is the stranger from Moab who shows the Israelites what this means. And this book ends with the genealogy of David's family. One scholar explains, this ending transforms the book from an account that expresses God's mercy towards certain righteous persons to a statement about how God acts mercifully in Israel's behalf by giving them their greatest monarch. If we connect this with the book of Judges, the purpose of Ruth becomes clear. In Judges, every man was doing what was right in his own eyes, and the nation was being punished as a result. How would God go about raising a king to rule over them in the middle of all this evil? Through judgment and through a seemingly impossible circumstance and through unlikely people putting their trust in him and obeying his law. He then enables Ruth to give birth to a child who would be an ancestor of the great Messiah that he would send to deliver his people once and for all. Daniel Block summarizes, this book and this genealogy demonstrate that in the dark days of the judges, the chosen line, the chosen seed, is preserved not by heroic exploits, by deliverers or kings, but by the good hand of God, who rewards good people, faithful people, with a fullness beyond all imagination. These characters could not know what long-range fruit their compassionate and loyal conduct towards each other would bear, but the narrator knows. With this genealogy, he declares the faithfulness of God in preserving the family that would bear the royal seed in troubled times and in rewarding the genuine godliness of his people. If only the rest of the nation had demonstrated such covenant faithfulness at the same time. In this genealogy, the names of Boaz and Obed are indeed proclaimed far beyond Bethlehem and Israel to the ends of the earth. But the narrator could not know what implications the godliness of these characters would have on generations of his own people that would come after him. If only he could have known that in the glorious providence of God, the Hesed, the loving kindness of Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, would have laid the groundwork for the history of salvation that extended far beyond his own time and place. For as the genealogy of Matthew 1 indicates, one greater than David comes from the loins of Boaz. In the dark days of the judges, the foundation is laid for the line that would produce the Savior, the Messiah, the Redeemer of a lost and destitute humanity. There are times in all of our lives where it feels perhaps like we are experiencing God's judgment, God's curse. And we look at ourselves and we wonder because we recognize we deserve it. Is there any hope for sinful people like us? Yes, there is hope. And that hope is not found in us, Ruth tells us, but in the faithfulness of God to his promise. Israel had rebelled against God. They deserved God's judgment. God did discipline Israel just the way he promised he would. But even as he's disciplining Israel, he is working to move forward his plan to rescue Israel, and not just rescue Israel, but to rescue us. We serve a God who is faithful, and we serve a God who is always, always at work accomplishing his promises. Count on it. Stop worrying about whether God's going to be faithful and start focusing instead on how you can be faithful to God like Ruth.